Did the PS5 just get hacked? We've also got an update on Hogwarts Legacy, and here's how your PS5 games are going to start looking even better. Let's jump into the PlayStation news. And before we get into it, make sure you're PS-ready by subscribing and setting your notifications to all. Alright, so one of the biggest upcoming third-party games that everyone's looking forward to on the PS5 is Hogwarts Legacy. If you haven't heard of this one yet, I don't know how, but essentially what it is it's an open-world RPG set well before the events of the Harry Potter movies, where you make your own character and live through a life of like 4 years in Hogwarts. Now this one was rumored for a long time before it was officially announced, and it's being worked on by Avalanche Software. No, not the one that made Just Cause, the other Avalanche Software. And this one was announced at the big PS5 showcase, and since then everyone's been super hyped for it. If I remember correctly, it was actually supposed to come out this month, but it was delayed to 2022 earlier this year, and everyone's been kind of waiting for an update on this one. Every time PlayStation does a showcase, there's rumors that it's going to be shown off there, and then unfortunately we're always disappointed because we have not heard anything about this game since it was delayed until now. So over at Warner Brothers, now that the Harry Potter mainline series is wrapped up, they started working on this movie series called Fantastic Beasts. They've had 2 of them come out, and they're all right. I think they've got the world nailed, they've got the characters all figured out. It's just the actual story they're trying to tell that doesn't really work for me all that much. But they're making a 3rd movie. It's going to take place leading up to World War II. It sounds pretty cool. And when the general manager over at Warner Brothers was giving an update on that 3rd movie, they let it slip that it's coming out before Hogwarts Legacy, but also that Hogwarts Legacy was going to be their 2nd big project in 2022 related to Harry Potter. So that basically tells us that it's going to come out after April of next year. And honestly, that makes a lot of sense. Harry Potter itself, the whole franchise, is really heavily tied to Christmas. That's a big part of every movie and every book. It's going to be a huge third-party game. They're obviously very confident in it, and if they have the fall wide open, since every big game seems to be coming out in like January or February next year, that could be a huge game that could go up against something like Call of Duty. So yeah, I think we're probably going to get this one late next year. I don't think it's going to get delayed anymore, because the reason they delayed it seemed like they didn't know how hyped this game was going to be. Like, it blew up after that first reveal at the PlayStation showcase, and I'm sure Warner Brothers was like, if we take this one back, work on it a little bit more, make it better than it was when it was supposed to release, which was this year, and I'm sure it got also pushed back because people are working from home, it'll end up being an awesome game, and then that can become a franchise on its own. And they really need that because, like I mentioned, the Fantastic Beasts franchise, it's still riding that Harry Potter name, and it makes a ton of money every time they release one, but there's a steady decline each time they release one of these movies in its box office return. So if Warner Brothers on their gaming side can create a hit with Hogwarts Legacy, I think that's going to be golden for them, and I think it's good that they delayed it, because a delayed game is never worse than before you delayed it. Anyway, getting back on track here, I honestly think we could get a surprise drop of a trailer or something for this game pretty soon, because right now there's a bunch of 20th anniversary stuff going on for the first Harry Potter movie. So if they do some sort of event or something tied to that, I feel like a good thing to show off would be some Hogwarts Legacy gameplay. And if we don't get that very soon, I'm assuming we'll probably get it around E3 or maybe even during the Game Awards later this year. There's a lot of opportunities for Warner Brothers to really blow the roof off of wherever they announce it and show us something cool. But yeah, just to recap, Fantastic Beasts 3 is coming out in April of next year, and Hogwarts Legacy is coming out in 2022 after that, according to a general manager at Warner Brothers, which I think personally is a pretty good source. So when you're looking at Sony, one of the things they're really good at is looking at the gaming landscape, or really the surrounding landscape and whatever market they're in, and finding features that people really like and then making it their own way and calling it a proprietary service. We just saw it recently with Dolby Vision, which just came to the Xbox Series X and Series S, and essentially what that is a better form of HDR that colors each frame of a game or a movie instead of just giving you a baseline coloring throughout the entire thing. Sony saw that Xbox was getting the exclusivity on that, and then they announced their own version of it, which I think was called like auto tone mapping. It has some very generic, like hyper specific Sony style name, and it's gonna come to the PS5 sooner rather than later, but the catch there was that you also need a Sony Bravia TV. They have a bunch of different ones it works with, ranging from like $700 all the way up to like $4,000. But that's a great example of Sony saying, nah, we don't need Dolby, we don't need to partner with other companies, we're just gonna do it ourselves. And ever since the PS5 was announced and I realized that they were using AMD chips inside the console, the one thing I was hoping they'd be able to figure out how to make their own version of is NVIDIA's DLSS. If you've ever played a PC game, you definitely know what DLSS is, this was also supposedly going to come to the Switch Pro if that was real. And essentially what it is a form of super sampling. So the game itself is rendering at a really low resolution to run really well, and then Nvidia's graphics card technology is using like AI or something like that to upscale the game and make it look like you're running it at a native whatever resolution, like 4K or 1440p. Now I was skeptical of this technology at first, but I play a ton of games on PC, and if it's done right, like it's implemented well, it's really hard to tell the difference between native whatever 4K and DLSS 4K. The one game where I really notice it the most is Control. That's a game that's notoriously hard to run, especially with ray tracing, but I'm able to pull like 60 frames per second locked at a native 1440p at ultra settings with the ray tracing bumped all the way up to high when I use DLSS. But if I turn off DLSS and run it natively at those resolutions, I'm not kidding, the frame rate goes down to like 12, literally 10 to 12 frames per second. So that's a good example of how this technology works. And before you jump down in the comments and tell me that AMD has their own competitor to it, I know that it just doesn't work as well. They also have their own Fidelity FX sharpening, which also makes games generally look worse if you use it. I don't know if it's like it's not being implemented well, or they rushed it to the market just to compete with Nvidia and say, look, we have our own form of DLSS, but it doesn't work that well. That's the point. So yeah, once I remember that Sony likes to make their own proprietary versions of other technologies, I've really been wanting them to work with AMD to figure something out here with the PS5. And I know PS5 games look really good, and there are a fair few games at this point that run at a native 4K 60 frames per second, and if they can't run at a native 4K, they're usually like 1440p upscaled and it looks amazing. But knowing how well DLSS works, I feel like we could get a native looking 4K in the future, especially when they start releasing stuff like the PS5 Pro and the regular PS5 starts to lag behind like the PS4 did last generation. By the end of the last generation, you essentially needed a PS4 Pro even to pull 30 frames per second out of games, so I feel like it's just going to work like that when they announce the PS5 Pro and release that into the public. So essentially, if they figure out a way to implement DLSS that could extend the lifespan of these original consoles, and at the end of the day, it can make games look and run even better. I mean, the PS5 is just barely, or is just about to be, a year old at this point, which is crazy, and we're already seeing next-gen games really pushing it to its limits with the frame rate. One game that I'm playing right now that I absolutely love is the Guardians of the Galaxy game, made over by Eidos Montreal, and everyone kind of thinks this is made in the Avengers engine, and it's not. It's its own thing that they kind of looked at Avengers and said, yeah, we're not doing that. We're making our own single-player, full-on narratively driven adventure game, and it came out great. But one area where it didn't come out so great is how it runs. Like, the game looks incredible. Honestly, probably the best facial animations I've ever seen in a game, other than something like, I don't know, Star Citizen or something you can't even run on a PS5 at this point. Guardians of the Galaxy, for a mass release AAA game, has the best facial animations I've ever seen. The graphics look incredible. There's huge vistas. There's really detailed foliage everywhere, and all of that makes the frame rate go down to the point where if you want to get a locked 60 frames per second out of this game on your PS5, you're going to have to drop the resolution all the way down to 1080p. Now, I also have the game on PC, and I'm running it at a much higher resolution, but I'm also using DLSS, and I'm getting 60 frames per second at settings much higher than my PC would be able to handle because I'm using DLSS. And you know what? It looks great. Comparing them side by side, I think it would be very hard to tell the difference. And obviously, it's not really a fair comparison because when you look at a console versus a PC, the reason you're getting a console over a PC is that generally they're a lot cheaper. Like, if you built a PC for $500, there's no way you'd be able to pull the graphics that you can get out of the PS5. I don't even think you'd be able to get close. And if Sony's able to figure out and implement their own version of DLSS like they've patented, which makes it seem like they've already cracked the code, which is awesome, it's going to be great overall for gamers, because at the end of the day, you're not going to know when it's implemented, because on PC there's that like placebo effect, right? You're like, oh man, my PC isn't good enough to run this game natively, I gotta use DLSS, and then you pixel peep for every issue you can find just to blame it on DLSS, because you don't want to like take that compromise. And it almost feels like an excuse for developers at a certain point where they're like, yeah, we're not going to optimize this game because we know we can just implement DLSS and it'll get there good enough where people won't complain about it. There's all those weird things you got to think about on PC, but if they implement it in the background on PS5 to get you that native 4K 60 frames per second and they don't say anything, you're probably not going to know any better. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but it would make me sleep better at night than having to tinker with everything on PC, because at the end of the day, that's why I like playing on PS5. Anyway, yeah, the fact that Sony has already patented this makes me think they've figured it out, at least to some capacity, which means we'll probably see it in the PS5 generation, and I like that. Whenever a new game console releases, the one question everyone asks is how fast is it going to be hacked? Because if you don't know, there's a lot of people out there who really love to go buy a console and jailbreak it so they can install emulators, they can play pirated games, they can pretty much do whatever they want with the console. And Sony has been fighting back against this for a very long time. The PSP was the first famous example of a console that was extremely easy to hack, and it had a really weird way of doing it. Like, it was so easy that me and my buddy figured it out when we were in high school. So all you really had to do was take the battery out of your PSP. All you would do is take it out, and then very carefully with an X-Acto knife, you would go all the way around the edge of the battery, just being very careful not to puncture the like plastic seal that was over the battery, because if the metal from the X-Acto knife touched the internal battery, it would expand and then you wouldn't be able to put it in your PSP, or it could have exploded. I don't know. There would be a chip on the battery, and there was one specific little like lever almost that you had to flip up with the X-Acto blade, and you were good to go. You could install the firmware that you wanted, you could pirate games, not that we ever did, you could install like whatever you wanted on your PSP, and it was super simple to do. It was roughly the same story with the PS4, and that brings us to the PS5, which unfortunately for Sony was just cracked by Fail Overflow. Now that Fail Overflow group name might sound familiar because this is actually the group that hacked the PS3, they hacked the PS4, they hacked the Nintendo Switch at a hardware level to the point where Nintendo had to make a full console revision and release that red box Nintendo Switch that not only had better battery life but fixed that hardware level hack. Now I'm definitely the farthest thing from an expert on this, but they say they found the root key of the software on the PS5, and they've actually been able to find the hardware level root key that each individual PS5 has. I don't know if that's going to continue to make it easier for them to hack it every time Sony obviously releases an update to patch it security wise, but still, it sounds like they figured out a way to crack the console, and I don't really know what you would do with that at this point. There's obviously the basic stuff like pirating games or making emulators run on the device, because the PS5 is an extremely powerful console. The first thing I think they do is try and get the PS3 emulator from PC running on the PS5, because at the end of the day, we all kind of know that the PS5 is essentially just a really strong PC. We all know that it could probably run PS3 games if Sony put in the work to make the emulator that they probably have access to work on the device, but they just aren't doing it because they haven't figured out a good way to make money off of it yet. So if these hackers were able to get that emulator running and then they say, hey, Sony, look, us normal people, just like the normal people who made the emulator in the first place, got PS3 games running on your PS5, that's going to make Sony look bad, and hey, maybe they'll implement a real way to play PS3 games on the console. Anyway guys, that's all the PlayStation news I have for you today. Make sure you let me know what you think down in the comments, and remember to subscribe and set your notifications to all if you haven't already. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.